When we consider a province for our capital, the first concession we have to make is that frankly most places do indeed meet the criteria for good enough. And while yes, some places will be marginally better than others, the cost of moving the capital is an important thing to consider, as well as the marginal losses of losing the proximity bonuses of the things you built up around your old capital. It is also the case of certain technologies, so for example, the Asian tech line is pretty strong, and Africa has some neat stuff too, but that requires your capital to either be or have been in Africa or Asia. So naturally, for the purposes of gaining access to those pretty powerful advancements, the best location for your capital is move it at least twice to get those buffs. But okay, those technicalities aside, where is the best location for your capital? Well, before we get into EU5 and find out, just a quick pit stop to say, a like will be appreciated and a subscription would be amazing if you haven't already. I've certainly drowned on about the 100k sub goal for ages, but look, I believe we can get there. Finally, if you're interested in EU5 or anything else on the Paradox store, please do use code Lemon Cake, it does help support the channel, but enough self-shilling, let's get into the video proper. And immediately, as we get into EU5, we're going to go ahead and make two more assumptions. First, I'm going to assume you want a big bad high pop, high tax based capital. I don't think this is necessarily optimal in the long run. For example, if you're playing as England, you should urbanize and build up provinces outside of London, especially when you consider raw materials. Look, London just doesn't really have the best stuff. There's only so many things you can do with wheat. Meanwhile, the fiber crops, the coal, the wool, the stone and iron, that's all going to be useful, but that's all outside of your capital. Even then, when you go over the building level limit inside your capital, well, that's going to destroy any efficiency you can hope to have from an optimal point of view. So again, you don't actually want to have a hypermassive capital. But we're not here for the optimal way of playing EU5, we're here for the best possible capital. So going to be ignoring all that and focusing primarily on, I want the biggest, baddest capital, which means I want the biggest, baddest capital with the highest population capacity and hence population inside of it. I do hope that's not a controversial enough take for a best capital video, but it nevertheless is something I think is important to mention. Secondly, we're going to assume that you're going to be pushing naval and not pushing land. And that's quite a big assumption, and we make that because ideally, if our capital is coastal, we're pushing naval, not over land. Naval isn't inherently worse than land. I actually think in the long run, naval can sometimes be stronger than pushing over land, but both are fully viable. The reason we're shoving our capital on the coast is we're min-maxing specifically for our capital here, so we want to obtain the is coastal bonus that is available for us, right? This is something we want to have access to. Do be aware, though, the debuff for being blockaded is pretty terrible. So if you're doing this, you need to, even if you're not pushing naval, still make sure you maintain naval superiority at all times, because blockade is going to make this bonus and then some go away. That being said, I'm going to assume you are going coastal and hence pushing naval. I mean, I guess you can go coastal and push land, but either way, I'm going to assume you're going coastal because it is better to have this bonus than, for example, if we were to consider an inland province, there's going to be no bonuses apart from the inability of being blockaded. But yes, just to be clear, I don't believe naval is inherently worse or better than land. The only reason I mention this as a sacrifice is we're sacrificing our options. So with that said, let's now talk about the things we'd want in our perfect ideal capital, and then see if we can find something that, if it doesn't meet all the criteria, meets as many of those criteria that we'd want. Firstly, we mentioned population, which means that for our capital, the climate and eventually proximity to the equator is going to be quite important. If you take a look at something like the oceanic climate, we have access to winter, which can be quite bad, decreasing food production, not something you'd want to have in the perfect capital. You'd want to be immune to winter, ideally, and you'd also want local population capacity to be as high as possible. Is there a climate that does this? Yes, there is. In fact, it's the best climate in the game, just from a numerical point of view. That is, of course, the Mediterranean climate. Now I'm starting to understand why Johan moved to this province in particular for no reason whatsoever. But yes, from an objective reality, the fact that you have no winter and the fact that you have a maximum local population capacity of 150%, the biggest bonus in the game, makes Mediterranean the best climate. Next though, ideally we want to be a farmland, giving extra maximum RGO size, loads of extra population capacity, local food production is good, some flat supply limit, and some local monthly development growth. The thing is, it does have debuffs, this is true, the proximity cost is a bit annoying, but doesn't matter for our capital, and the road building time can be a touch annoying, but once you build them, I don't think plus 10% road building time is that big of a deal. Like, oh no, instead of waiting 10 months, I have to wait 11 for the road to build. The horror. The road's going to be finished 1 month later. Look, if your strategy fails because your road took 1 month longer to build, that's on you. The movement cost for units is probably the only thing that actually notes there as a debuff, but overall, I think the buffs are better than the debuffs, and hence I would advocate for the farmland vegetation type. So far, our ideal capital is a Mediterranean farm. It also goes without saying that you do want to be on flatland, and the reason I mention this is actually a decent chunk of Mediterranean farmland isn't on flat terrain. So this province here in Adana is, indeed, as you may notice, a Mediterranean farmland, but it's actually a wetland, which does unfortunately disqualify it because these debuffs are pretty brutal. So no, ideally you'll be flat. There is an argument to be made for hills or mountains, which are extra pointy hills. However, my issue is that while yes, it is better to be able to hide your armies inside your capital or have some extra dice roll bonuses for your capital cities, my concern is that debuffs to local monthly development growth and local food production kind of do suck, so let's avoid that. We are looking at the perfect capital after all. So okay, we're flat and on a farm in the Mediterranean. Where to next? Well, now I want to consider the danger map mode. That is to say that everything in red has kind of an implicit worse situation to be off. Look, some capitals are pretty good, but if your capital is on an earthquake zone next to a volcano, I'm going to have to knock you down for that. Ideally, you are not in an earthquake zone, and ideally you're not next to a present volcano. That just helps not having volcanoes erupt next to you, you know? Pretty reasonable demands if I say so myself. And if you're not on an earthquake zone, you're probably not going to get an earthquake. Actually, don't quote me on this, but I think you literally can't get an earthquake unless it's like an event earthquake if you're not on an earthquake zone. So indeed, for a perfect capital, we wouldn't have any local dangers. Next though, we are coastal, which means we'd ideally like to have a lot of harbour capacity. Now, eventually you can build up harbour capacity from buildings like wharfs, and the total amount that you can build up, I believe, is 2 buildings gives you 0.1, and then a final building gives you 0.35, and then there's a government reform that gives you base harbour capacity everywhere on coastal provinces and so on and so forth. But I'd say it's reasonable to build up to around 0.25, 0.3 harbour capacity from investment. So while 0.7 is fine enough, or even 0.85, ideally, in the perfect capital, you'd have 100 harbour capacity, and you just have 100 capacity from day one. So, for example, Brest just has 100% harbour capacity forever, and does not need any investment to be at 100 harbour capacity. You can, of course, still build a harbour there, it just wouldn't do anything towards the harbour capacity, it's already at 100%. Next, we'd want to be on a market centre. This is relatively debatable, because of course you can move market centres, but this is if you are doing it at home, you'd want to move your market centre to your capital. The reason is, of course, is that the further away you are from your capital and market centre, the worse the market access modifiers get. For those unaware, if we take a look at, for example, York, where there is some industry, York has a market access of 62%. So this brewery in York, if we take a look at its output, is outputting 1 beer, but it's been reduced by 0.62 or multiplied by 0.62 because we only have 62% market access. So we want the perfect capital, and as such we want our market to be slap bang on top of said capital as well. Now again, markets are movable, it's just something that is important to mention. The other thing, though, is that we do want good trade goods inside of our capital so we can build up good, profitable industries. And this is really where London, for example, falls apart because it makes wheat, and some vegetables. You can't really build an empire on some wheat and vegetables, I'm afraid. You want trade goods like silk instead, which can be involved in very profitable industries like fine cloth, and ideally have multiple of them within the same state to provide the maximum throughput bonuses for the maximum amount of industries. And while wheat isn't bad, it is used in beer and distilleries after all. The trade goods you are trying to look out for are silk, silver and gold, and hence gemstones for your jewelry workshops, but also iron, livestock, leather, wood, coal and wool are all also excellent trade goods to have for the throughput production efficiencies. Finally, because irrigation is a very strong building, especially to have in your capital, you want your capital to have access to the irrigation building, and hence you want it to be located on fresh water or a lake, basically, so lakes or rivers. There are other buildings that also require, dare I say, fresh water. Very Civ 5-y to be honest, but yes, indeed, if you take a look at irrigation, we're going to need to be on a river or adjacent to a lake. And one of the things you will indeed find is that, to the best of my knowledge, a Mediterranean flat farmland farm with no danger, max harbour capacity, a market centre with good trade goods and fresh water doesn't unfortunately exist, unless I've been very blind and missed it, so we're going to have to make some compromises. And within my understanding, I've got the person I think is the best, which I'm going to be mentioning soon, but there's also some runners-up I would like to mention nevertheless. But okay, enough waiting. I hope you understood both my criteria, and hopefully you agree with my reasoning, but my pitch for the best capital in EU5 is going to be the city of Constantinople. Let's immediately mention the two negatives the city has. It is unfortunately on an earthquake zone. This sucks. It also cannot build irrigation. This sucks. But with those two issues aside, it is perfect. It starts with 100% harbour capacity, even has a sound toll, which is just a little bit of an extra sprinkle on top, as well as, of course, being a holy site. It is a flat, Mediterranean, farmland, coastal location, making it perfect, and the trade goods are incredible. The trade good itself on the city is silk, which is a very, very profitable trade good, and has throughput efficiencies on side the tailors guilds, because fine cloth tends to be one of the more profitable, if not just in the early game, but frankly throughout the entire campaign. I find fine cloth to be a very profitable endeavor. But not only does it have access to silk, the other provinces inside of Constantinople, wool, which gives you throughput on spinners guilds, which is excellent, fish, which is terrible, but we can't all be perfect, fiber crops, which is amazing, it gives you throughput on paper, and paper, as well as that whole book line, is a very profitable industry, and wheat. Again, not the best trade good, but a good way of feeding your empire, as well as giving you throughput on beers and distilleries inside your capital if you so choose. Then again, though, I'm certainly not going to be singing its praises. The main three ones are fiber crops, wool, and silk for your throughput. So yeah, that's the winner. Now let's mention some runners-up, and there are probably going to be some you didn't expect, although there certainly will be others that you definitely did. Because in my opinion, the actual runner-up to Constantinople is going to be Tunis. That might seem quite surprising, but why Tunis? Well, Tunis also has that perfect combo of a 100% harbour capacity Mediterranean coastal location that is a farmland Mediterranean flatland province, and it's in Africa, which gives you an implicit 100% disease resistance to malaria for fun. You just get that. I think that's a bit absurd. I don't think people in Africa have 100% disease resistance to malaria, but you know what? Sometimes it's best not to question Paradox's decisions. It does continue to tick a bunch of boxes as well, with a pretty good trade good distribution. If you take a look, dyes is certainly a good trade good, but unfortunately, well, olives aren't great, fish is not great, livestock is nice for leather, so that helps, and wheat we previously mentioned as not actually that good, but good for feeding your people. The other thing that comes to mind is cotton, and cotton can be good, but it's almost good, and this is what knocks me down. It's almost a very good throughput for your tailors guilds, but cotton can only be turned into spinners guilds into cloth, and then that cloth has to be turned into fine cloth, and that's fine when you're building your industries. Unfortunately, because cloth is not a raw resource material like silk, you can't get production efficiency throughput even if you make it inside the same province, which is very sad, and hence why Tunis gets knocked down a peg quite a bit compared to Constantinople, which makes silk instead of cotton, and hence is better. Tunis also cannot have any irrigation, but at least compared to Constantinople, it's not an earthquake zone. So, you lose some, you win some. The next location is actually going to be Sevilla. Now, Sevilla is also, you've guessed it at this point, a coastal farmland Mediterranean flatland, although I do have to tell the Paradox developers, I don't think this province is Mediterranean. I just have a feeling that's slightly outside the meta at this point, but you know what? I'll let them decide on that. At the end of the day, we're talking about climate, not proximity to Mediterranean, so I guess it's okay to say that Sevilla is Mediterranean. Certainly makes it for a better settlement. My issues with Sevilla is the very imperfect harbour capacity, certainly not the best harbour to have, and ironically, as Spain, you're going to have better harbours. In some cases, literally 2 provinces away, down in Cadiz, you have a 100% of just base harbour capacity harbour, which is incredible. But at least that 0.55 means eventually, with some extra advances and building up, I do believe it is possible to get the harbour capacity of Sevilla to 100%. That being said, again, there is no danger here, and it is also a market centre. Same about Tunis, actually, didn't mention it for them. And the trade goods are excellent over around Sevilla too. Not quite perfect, but you do get quite a large selection. Olives are certainly not great within Sevilla itself, but the highlights are, of course, the silver in Constania, which is absolutely amazing for jewelry industry throughput, and the cotton is also just outside of your door as well, which is, again, not quite perfect, but still gives you throughput on spinners guilds if you are actually using the cotton. Ironically, though, because of the very high price of cotton in Europe and the relatively low price of wool in Europe, you're probably actually going to be running the wool just because it's cheaper. So as you can see, we would gain 10% production efficiency, but it doesn't make up for the differences in price between the cotton and the wool. So yeah, much better off to not actually use the bonus in practice, which is a shame. That said though, it does have the ability to build irrigation, which is not trivial and should be considered. And the final runner-up, to the surprise of absolutely no one, is of course still going to be Rome. While not quite a market centre, the nearest market centre of Naples is right there, so you can go ahead and borrow it, and early game before you borrow it, it's not the end of the world. 80% market access does suck, but it's not the worst, and again, it can certainly be fixed, and it's only up from this 80%. That said, though, unfortunately, the lack of starting market center is not the only debuff for Rome. Its natural harbor is absolutely terrible, which makes sense. Rome shouldn't be coastal. Rome, even today, isn't coastal, and this is why Rome today has a separate port place, and the historical port of Rome was Ostia. But okay, Paradox made Rome coastal, that's their choice to make. Nevertheless, the only other issue I have with Rome, which is holding it back, is actually the trade goods around Rome aren't great. Wheat, again, isn't the best trade good. Olives are also not the best trade good, I'm sorry to say, for industry. And sand is probably the closest you have to actually being a good thing, but the only thing sand is good for is the glass industry, and there's only so much glass industry you can build. And the other problem with glass industry is that the AI likes to build a lot of glass industry in very inefficient places, and there's a lot of inputs to the glass industry, which means it's a bit hard to get the full production efficiency bonus. In here, we're only getting 7%, so getting 3% less of our 10%, not the best environment. And even then, glass isn't always profitable because I don't know why AI just loves to build unprofitable glass guilds everywhere, which again, it does hurt its actual production. That said, I think if the AI stops doing that, which might just happen, we're one update away from the AI economy being reworked, so it could eventually become good, but at this point, glass, look, I'm not going to say that you can build an empire in glass, because that would be a lie. Otherwise, every other condition, namely that you are a coastal, farmland, Mediterranean, flatland province, that even again, just about has access to irrigation, well, that's a good thing. And with that, Constantinople wins, Rome and Boos rejoice, and I conclude the video here. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, Lemon, Lozendica, Nick Haas, Nanhatan, Star72, The Awesome Rabbit, Best Friend Gaming, Grandma Flavia, Lebarule, W. Haste Sov, Anthony35, AC Napa, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Danray, Malvi, Jack, Ryland, Stuart Allen, Andrew Black, Nebula, Centronic, Toynet, and Aquabird.